One man's signature sits on orders that killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined. Mao Zedong didn't stumble into power through luck or circumstance. He methodically dismantled his enemies, manipulated millions, and orchestrated the deaths of 45 million Chinese citizens through calculated policies disguised as progress. Not exactly the kind of legacy you'd put on a resume, right? Today, we're examining the psychological blueprint of history's deadliest leader. How does someone convince a nation to destroy itself? The answer lies in understanding Mao's three core strategies that turned neighbors into executioners: fear, propaganda, and ruthless political purges. But every monster has an origin story, and Mao's began in a small village where violence first taught him the rules of power. Born December 26, 1893 in Shaoshan village, Mao Zedong learned his first lesson about power from a rice farmer who ruled through violence. Mao Runsheng beat his eldest son regularly and publicly humiliated him when the boy questioned his authority. The beatings weren't disciplinary measures. They were demonstrations of absolute power that taught young Mao how human nature really worked. At age 13, Mao refused to participate in his father's business meetings. When Mao Runsheng threatened to beat him in front of guests, the teenager grabbed a kitchen knife and threatened to kill himself unless his father apologized publicly. The standoff lasted 3 hours. His father backed down. Mao discovered that the threat of extreme violence could force even the strongest authority figure to submit. When teachers assigned work he disliked, Mao organized student strikes. When school administrators punished him, he convinced other students to boycott classes until the punishment was reversed. Each victory reinforced his belief that traditional power structures could be destroyed through calculated rebellion and manipulation of group dynamics. Mao's fascination with historical violence began during his teenage years, when he discovered stories of peasant rebellions in Chinese history. He studied the tactics of leaders like Hong Xiuquan, who convinced millions of followers that mass killing was necessary for social transformation. Mao filled notebooks with detailed accounts of how these rebels used religious fervor and class hatred to justify slaughtering entire populations. At Hunan First Normal School, Mao encountered Yang Chengji, a philosophy professor who taught that human nature could be completely transformed through moral education and social pressure. Yang believed that people were essentially blank slates who could be reshaped into ideal citizens through proper guidance. Mao absorbed these teachings but twisted them into something darker. If humans could be morally transformed, he reasoned, then violence against those who resisted transformation was not only acceptable but necessary. These experiences crystallized into 3 psychological lessons that would define his entire political career. First, fear was more reliable than respect. When his father beat him, neighbors looked away and said nothing. When he threatened violence against his father, everyone paid attention and took his demands seriously. Second, power came through group pressure. Individual resistance crumbled when isolated people faced organized opposition. Third, any amount of suffering could be justified if presented as moral necessity. Mao's first taste of real political power came when he organized student protests against the provincial government in 1919. He discovered he possessed an unusual talent for identifying people's deepest fears and resentments, then weaponizing those emotions against common enemies. When wealthy students hesitated to join his protests, Mao spread rumors that they were secretly collaborating with corrupt officials. When poor students lacked confidence, he convinced them that their poverty made them morally superior to their oppressors. He cataloged every social humiliation, personal vengeance notes that fueled future purges. Yang Chengji's philosophical teachings provided the intellectual framework Mao needed to justify his instincts toward violence and control. If human nature could be transformed through social pressure, then those who resisted transformation were obstacles to human progress. But childhood tactics were one thing. Surviving the deadly world of Chinese revolutionary politics would require eliminating rivals before they eliminated him. By October 1934, Mao Zedong was a marked man. The Communist Party's Central Committee had placed him under virtual house arrest after his radical land policies failed catastrophically in Jiangxi province. Senior leaders like Bo Gu and Otto Braun controlled party strategy while Mao watched from the sidelines. When the Long March began, party officials assigned him a ceremonial position carrying stretchers for wounded soldiers. His political career appeared finished. But Mao saw opportunity in the chaos. As communist forces retreated across China, losing battles and hemorrhaging troops, he began collecting intelligence on his rivals' mistakes. He carried small notebooks where he recorded conversations, noting which leaders showed fear under pressure and which ones contradicted themselves during strategy meetings. He wasn't writing poetry, just the death warrants of his rivals. Mao documented 2 catastrophic errors that would destroy his enemies. Otto Braun, the German military advisor, had ordered communist forces to fight conventional battles against superior nationalist armies, treating Chinese guerrillas like European infantry. His rigid tactics led directly to the loss of their Jiangxi base and thousands of casualties. Bogu had supported these disastrous strategies while never setting foot on an actual battlefield, making life-or-death decisions from the safety of headquarters. The Zunyi Conference in January 1935 gave Mao his chance to strike. It was a showdown in a freezing mountain hall, where Mao held the cards while everyone else trembled. Communist losses had reached crisis levels after repeated defeats by nationalist forces. Party members demanded answers for the military disasters that had cost them their base and thousands of soldiers. Mao presented his carefully compiled evidence against the current leadership with surgical precision. He accused Otto Braun of treating Chinese soldiers like European infantry, ignoring local terrain and enemy tactics. When Bogu attempted to defend the party's military record, Mao countered with detailed casualty figures and testimony from field commanders who had questioned orders but been overruled. During the conference debates, Mao employed a calculated strategy of appearing reluctant to criticize his comrades while systematically destroying their credibility. He prefaced each attack with statements about party unity and collective responsibility, then delivered devastating critiques that made his rivals appear incompetent and dangerous to the communist cause. His alliance building during this period followed a precise pattern. Mao promised Zhou Enlai expanded military authority if Zhou backed his leadership bid. Even while courting Zhou's support, Mao mentally cataloged the man's tendency toward compromise, a weakness that could be exploited later. He convinced Zhu Dai that only Mao understood guerrilla warfare well enough to defeat the nationalists, while noting Zhu's loyalty to whoever held power, information stored for future use. The timing of Mao's power grab was no accident. He waited until the long march had weakened his opponents physically and psychologically before making his move. The constant retreat and military pressure had exhausted party leaders and made them desperate for new solutions. Communist forces needed decisive leadership, and Mao positioned himself as the only alternative to continued defeat. Mao mastered the technique of making his personal ambitions appear inseparable from party survival. He convinced other leaders that eliminating his rivals was not about settling scores, but about saving the communist revolution from certain destruction. His enemies' removal seemed like strategic necessity rather than political assassination. With party control secured, Mao faced a far greater challenge. Controlling a handful of communist leaders was one thing. Reshaping the minds of 600 million Chinese citizens would require weapons more powerful than bullets or bayonets. Mao studied the propaganda methods that had kept Napoleon in power and enabled Stalin to transform Soviet society. He discovered that controlling information flow was more effective than controlling territory. Armies could be defeated, but ideas could reshape entire civilizations. Mao began constructing a system that would rewrite reality itself for 600 million Chinese citizens. Traditional Chinese culture revered family elders, Confucian scholars, and ancestral wisdom. Mao's propaganda systematically attacked these pillars of authority by reframing reality through state media. Newspapers published articles claiming old customs kept China weak. Radio broadcasts repeated messages that traditional thinking was a disease preventing progress. Complex social problems received simple solutions that always involved destroying enemies of the people. Personal suffering was reframed as necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Within months, questioning ancient practices became a sign of patriotic loyalty. Imagine swapping your favorite childhood poem for cheering Mao quotes in school assemblies. Overnight, values flipped. The Little Red Book emerged as Mao's most effective weapon against traditional Chinese thought. Published in 1964, this collection of simplified quotations was designed to replace centuries of accumulated wisdom with Mao's personal philosophy. Factory workers received copies with their paychecks. Students memorized passages instead of classical poetry. Farmers carried the book to collective meetings where they recited verses that redefined basic concepts like family, loyalty, and morality. Mass rallies transformed isolated doubts into public confessions of faith. Mao organized gatherings where hundreds of thousands of people heard speeches about the party's achievements. Local officials tracked enthusiasm levels and flagged anyone showing insufficient support for later political education sessions. The psychological pressure made questioning the party line feel impossible and dangerous. Children became the primary targets of Mao's indoctrination system. Schools replaced traditional subjects with political education classes, where students learned that Mao's wisdom surpassed that of their parents and teachers. Young Pioneers organizations recruited elementary school children, who reported suspicious conversations they overheard at home. Teachers who maintained friendships with former colleagues were denounced by their own students for harboring backward thinking. Textbooks were rewritten to present Chinese history as a series of class struggles that culminated in Mao's victory over oppression. Students learned that their grandparents had been exploited by landlords and merchants until the Communist Party liberated them from suffering. This narrative convinced young people that their elders' memories of pre-revolutionary life were either false or irrelevant. Mao's personal image underwent careful construction to replace traditional authority figures in Chinese society. Propaganda posters depicted him as both a caring father figure and an all-knowing leader whose wisdom guided every aspect of daily life. His photographs appeared in homes where ancestor portraits had previously hung. His sayings were quoted with the reverence once reserved for Confucian teachings. The system succeeded because it made questioning dangerous while presenting acceptance as rational self-interest. Citizens who expressed doubts faced social isolation, loss of employment, and potential imprisonment. Those who enthusiastically supported party policies received better housing, food rations, and educational opportunities for their children. So with reality rewritten and the Chinese people primed to believe anything their leader told them, what deadly policy did Mao pitch first? On February 7, 1958, Mao Zedong announced the Great Leap Forward to party officials gathered in Beijing. China would surpass Britain in steel production within 15 years. Peasants would smelt metal in backyard furnaces while growing record harvests. The nation would transform from agricultural society to industrial superpower through revolutionary willpower alone. What Mao created instead was systematic mass murder disguised as economic policy. The truth about Mao's intentions emerged years later through party documents and witness testimony. He knew the policies would cause widespread starvation before implementation began. During planning meetings, agricultural experts warned that diverting farmers from crop production to steelmaking would create food shortages. Mao dismissed these concerns as counter-revolutionary thinking. He told officials that population reduction might benefit China's long-term development. The backyard furnaces served a dual purpose that had nothing to do with steel production. Peasants melted down farming tools, cooking pots, and metal implements to feed the crude smelters. The resulting metal was completely unusable for construction or manufacturing. But the process destroyed agricultural equipment that farmers needed for planting and harvesting. Without proper tools, crop yields collapsed across rural China. Mao had weaponized industrial policy to create artificial famine. Provincial officials understood the deadly implications, but feared contradicting Mao's directives. They reported harvest figures that bore no relationship to actual food production. Henan province claimed grain yields had increased 400% in 1958. These fabricated statistics provided Mao with the justification he needed for his next lethal decision. If harvests were breaking records, China could afford to export millions of tons of grain to allies and trading partners. Throughout 1959 and 1960, freight trains carried rice and wheat to the Soviet Union, while Chinese peasants died of starvation in surrounding villages. Shipping grain out while villagers ate bark, that's a political flex. Export revenues funded Mao's industrial projects, while rural populations consumed grass and leather to survive. Mao employed psychological warfare against anyone who questioned the policy's effectiveness. He labeled critics as rightists who lacked faith in the people's revolutionary spirit. Local officials who reported accurate harvest data were accused of sabotaging national progress. Farmers who complained about food shortages were charged with spreading counter-revolutionary propaganda. The punishment for these offenses was death or imprisonment in labor camps. His physician noted Mao's cool detachment as millions starved, a chilling indifference. Dr. Li Jisui documented conversations where Mao discussed casualty reports from rural provinces with apparent indifference. When informed that millions were dying from hunger, Mao responded that revolutionary progress required sacrifice from the people. Li's medical records showed that Mao maintained his normal diet of favorite dishes, while peasants died in their fields. The Great Leap Forward killed an estimated 15 to 45 million Chinese citizens between 1958 and 1962. Most died from starvation caused by Mao's deliberate destruction of agricultural systems. Others perished in labor camps after questioning the policy's logic. The campaign succeeded in proving that Mao could make the Chinese people accept any narrative he constructed, regardless of the physical evidence contradicting his claims. He'd proved he could starve a nation. But surviving party officials who remembered this catastrophe were beginning to whisper doubts about their leader's judgment. Mao's response to these growing concerns would target the most vulnerable members of Chinese society. By May 1966, he confronted his most dangerous enemy yet. Party officials who had witnessed the Great Leap Forward's catastrophic failure were quietly questioning his leadership behind closed doors. Veterans like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping possessed detailed knowledge of Mao's policy disasters and growing influence among younger party members. His solution would unleash the most psychologically devastating campaign in modern history. The Cultural Revolution began with a seemingly innocent directive to Chinese schools. Students should criticize teachers who promoted old ideas that held back revolutionary progress. Within weeks, Mao had transformed this educational reform into a nationwide assault on anyone over 30 years old. He called his shock troops the Red Guards and gave them authority to identify and punish enemies of the people anywhere they found them. Mao understood teenage psychology better than any dictator in history. Adolescents naturally rebel against adult authority while desperately seeking importance and recognition. He understood teenage rebellion and unleashed it as a weapon. He convinced young people that their parents and teachers were secret enemies who had deceived them their entire lives. Students who had previously respected their elders now saw them as obstacles to China's revolutionary future. The Red Guards received official permission to use violence against anyone they deemed counter-revolutionary. Mao's directives were deliberately vague about limits or oversight. Students could torture teachers who assigned traditional literature. Children could beat parents who expressed nostalgia for pre-revolutionary customs. Teenagers could execute neighbors who owned books or artifacts from China's imperial past. 16-year-old Wang Guangmei turned in her father to local authorities after discovering he kept a diary that mentioned food shortages during the Great Leap Forward. She testified at his public trial that his private thoughts proved he lacked faith in the party's wisdom. Wang's father was sentenced to 20 years in a labor camp where he died within 18 months. Wang received praise from party officials and admission to Beijing University as a reward for her revolutionary vigilance. Across China, children competed to prove their political loyalty through violence against their own families, ransacking homes for evidence of counter-revolutionary thinking and reporting conversations they had overheard years earlier. This campaign tore families apart, shattered centuries of culture, and did it all under the guise of youthful zeal. The campaign's psychological sophistication became clear through Mao's public statements during the violence. He praised Red Guards for their revolutionary courage while never explicitly ordering specific acts of brutality. His speeches contained coded language that encouraged escalation without creating evidence of direct responsibility. When violence exceeded even his expectations, Mao could claim the students had misunderstood his intentions. And he watched it all unfold from Beijing, orchestrating chaos like a conductor of terror. Party documents show he received daily briefings about Red Guard activities and casualty figures from different provinces. He made strategic decisions about which targets to protect and which to sacrifice based on their potential threat to his personal authority. By the time the violence finally subsided, Mao had achieved something unprecedented in human history. He had convinced an entire generation to destroy their own civilization while believing they were heroes. When Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976, Chinese state media announced the passing of the great helmsman who had guided the nation to revolutionary victory. The official obituary praised his wisdom and sacrifice for the Chinese people. What the broadcasts did not mention was the 45 million corpses his policies had created across 3 decades of rule. The numbers tell the story of systematic extermination. The Great Leap Forward killed 15 to 45 million through deliberate starvation. The Cultural Revolution added millions more through labor camps and public executions, while land reform purges eliminated hundreds of thousands of property owners. But here's the psychological twist that made Mao uniquely terrifying among history's monsters. How do you starve a nation and still have them cheer? By rewriting their reality from birth. These victims died believing their suffering served a greater cause. Peasants who starved during the Great Leap Forward thought their sacrifice would help China surpass Western nations industrially. Students who were beaten to death by Red Guards believed they were martyrs for revolutionary progress. Parents who were executed by their own children died thinking their deaths would create a better future for the next generation. Mao had convinced millions that their murder was actually patriotic service. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire families were destroyed when children denounced parents to authorities. Traditional relationships between teachers and students collapsed when education became indoctrination. Cultural knowledge accumulated over centuries vanished when Red Guards burned libraries and executed scholars. Multiple generations grew up in constant fear that any conversation could be reported as counter-revolutionary activity. From digital surveillance to social media propaganda, the echoes of Mao's playbook resonate worldwide. Modern authoritarian leaders study his techniques as a blueprint for population control. His methods of using propaganda to create alternate realities appear in contemporary political movements. The tactic of turning children against parents has been adopted by extremist groups seeking to break traditional social bonds. His strategy of manufacturing enemies to unite supporters remains a standard tool of dictatorial governments. Mao's system operated with chilling efficiency because it required minimal direct intervention from him personally. Once established, the psychological mechanisms he created became self-sustaining. Citizens policed each other's thoughts and behavior without government oversight. Children monitored parents for signs of disloyalty. Neighbors reported suspicious conversations to local party officials. The fear of denunciation created a surveillance network that operated automatically. Despite the massive death toll and documented evidence of his brutality, Mao's image remains revered by some Chinese citizens today. His portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square. Tourist sites celebrate his revolutionary achievements while ignoring the humanitarian catastrophes he orchestrated. This continued reverence demonstrates the lasting effectiveness of his propaganda machine, which created psychological conditioning that persists decades after his death. Historians who study dictatorial psychology note that Mao's methods differed significantly from other 20th century tyrants. Hitler relied heavily on military force and racial ideology to maintain control. Stalin used institutional terror through secret police and show trials. Mao achieved comparable results primarily through psychological manipulation that made victims complicit in their own destruction. We've seen the body count, but the real legacy lies in the minds he reshaped. The psychological architecture he constructed reveals the true scope of his genius for destruction. Mao Zedong's real talent was not politics or economics. He understood that human psychology could be weaponized against entire populations. His blueprint followed 3 core strategies: childhood fear, rival elimination, and reality distortion. Each method reinforced the others to create total psychological control. The most chilling aspect of Mao's reign wasn't the 45 million deaths he caused. It was how willingly his victims participated in their own destruction. Chinese citizens starved while praising his wisdom. Children executed parents while believing they served justice. Next time you hear a political slogan, remember how easily reality can be rewritten. If you learned something that still gives you chills, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video and hit subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. See you next time on Crime Republic.